4, 3, 2, and 1. We got everyone pouring in for the Art of Move. My name is Anthony Manuel, here with my good friend Dr. William Raybar. We are joined here today by two guests, not one guest, two guests. We have Devon Brown of One of a Kind Fitness, and we have Cesar Clavijo of Stillness Academy. I'm really, really excited. Just a quick introduction to our guests today. Devon is the owner and founder of One of a Kind Fitness, which is his private personal training business, currently training people virtually, driving to their homes, or renting out space in a gym. One of a Kind Fitness is a system of exercises and concepts derived from reverse engineering natural, durable, and elite human movement. By understanding how the human body is naturally developed and designed to move from crawling to walking to running, we can create exercises that help rebuild those foundational attributes. This allows you to rebalance the tensegrity structure that is your body and get back to an active, pain-free life. We can then advance these exercises and take your performance to the next level. And then Cesar is a holistic health professional and a martial artist living in Beaufort, South Carolina. He's a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. Cesar left the military to further heal and develop himself and to help others do the same through Stillness Academy, the holistic training center he founded in 2013. As a Czech professional, go-to coach, stillness concepts practitioner, and jiu-jitsu black belt, he helps youth and adults to move and live as more capable, confident humans facing life in the 21st century. Now, to anyone who is joining us here live, just a little bit of a background, we are hopping on to discuss the spinal engine theory, the idea that the spine is the primary driver of locomotion, because Cesar had this really great Instagram post that got our attention and got a lot of attention in the comments section, where basically it was this idea that the spine is or is not the primary driver of locomotion. So guys, actually, Cesar, do you want to give a little bit of a background about that post for those who didn't see it and kind of what your reasoning behind it was?
Sure. But first, just in case anybody local is listening, people from Beaufort are really picky about the way that you say it. Because we are not. So
that's my Quebecois French Canadian coming out.
Oh, yeah. So I'm in Beaufort, South Carolina, which is very close to Beaufort, North Carolina.
Okay.
So anyway, so there's that. Yeah. And so, I think well, first, thank you guys also for having us on. I have a lot of respect for Devon. We were sort of roommates, as we mentioned before, before we went live. When we did the GOTA certification a few years back. And, funny enough, I feel like a lot of Devon's work has really inspired me, and it's some of his own ideas about the stabilization of the lumbopelvic hip complex and the tendency for some systems to focus on the byproducts as opposed to the attributes that cause those byproducts. Those ideas over time are actually what led me to, I guess, my dissatisfaction with spine engine theory.
Not funny. Love it.
But essentially, yeah. So in the post, there's a couple of things that I take issue with. I guess we have to maybe distinguish between this idea of the spine as an engine and spinal engine theory. Part of my issue with the whole thing is the linguistics of it, and Devon and I have talked about this a little bit. This framing it in such a way that it might seem like the spine actually does something when the spine is it's non-contractile tissue. So the spine just can't, right? And even if we attach the pelvis to it, there's the pelvis. So something has to be driving those structures. But I get it. It makes it maybe a little bit easier to digest when you frame it this way. But I do feel like there are a lot of people out there, whether professionals or laymen, that start to think the spine is actually doing something. So then when we start getting into what's actually then driving it, right? If it's not the bones of the spine, what's driving the bones of the spine? What are the muscles involved with that? Then we start connecting to the pelvis. And, it's, I guess, my contention that those muscles, one, don't really function the way they're supposed to without the legs. And I alluded to that in my post talking about Grakovetsky's, video with the guy with no legs, and we can get into that later. But I think, really when you try to take this reductionist mechanical view of the body, we break it down into these pieces, like what is the engine. It's easy to make this thing really complicated, because then we have to talk about, like, what do you mean by engine actually? So that presents a number of issues. And then there's a bunch of things that I think Gravetsky gets wrong when he starts making some of his, let's say, arguments outside of kinematics. So when he starts positing things like evolutionary theory as justification for his model, I think that there's a bunch he gets wrong there. So I guess to recap that, for me, it's the language, it's the reductionist thinking. I think he gets some of his evolutionary arguments wrong, and I think that he's wrong about that hip walking video.
Right. Okay. So that's what I heard is there's some issue with the linguistics of referring a lot, like just even referring to the spine as an engine, because what comes to mind with the spine is the actual bony structure, and then even if you attach the pelvis to it, you're still looking at the bony structures, and there's nothing inherently like locomotive about these bony structures. There's nothing actually initiating movement from within these structures, even if you add the tissues of that, the pelvis and the muscles around the spine. You're still seeing that they can't necessarily execute the locomotive patterns or behaviors independent of their connection to the limbs, is what I'm hearing. And so, Devon, you commented on this post, and you kind of posited almost a different view. You said, I actually do view the spine as one of the originating points of locomotion. Can you elaborate on your view in that sense?
Yeah. So first, thank you again for having me on, guys. Anthony and Will, Caesar, great to see you again, man.
You too, man.
Quick thing, real quick. When we talked about this live before, when we were rooming together, Caesar was actually practicing some Wim Hof breathing while we were roommates, and I was essentially on the other side, just hearing this guy start to breathe. And if you've ever heard Wim Hof going off, it's just that breathing going on. So it was a funny little meeting, but in the end, yeah, we gathered like a nice little group of people together who kind of put together theories and thoughts and things, and didn't just take everything as, like this is the new thing. It's kind of like we want to challenge those ideas. So we're very much like you guys in the sense that we're looking through every model, every method there is, and trying to figure out why it works and how it works, and that way we can integrate it in what we do, right? But then to go on to this, so let's go on the whole Instagram. With that, me and Caesar talked a little bit. In the beginning, we talked about basically it being an argument over the title of the actual theory, to where I don't believe the spine itself, the bones are moving, right? I believe, I mean, they're obviously moving in the movements, but they're not moving. They're not actually causing that movement to happen. Like you said, there's no contractile tissue there. It's not forcing that. You're not seeing a skeleton walk around without any muscles, things like that. But in the end, the theory is, what's his name? Sergei Gratsovetsky. It's his theory. It's kind of what he named it, to be against the whole model of your legs are doing all the moving. Your spine is just a passenger for that ride, and it's just kind of going along with those legs. So when I commented on that, I was really trying to point out that your spine is the centerpiece of all the moving parts. So without your, let's say, your lumbopelvic hip complex rotating and your thoracic and shoulders counter rotating that, you're not getting any of that movement that the spinal engine theory would be talking about. You're not getting that lateral flexion, that rotation, that recoil, all that movement. And you're not really getting very much spiraling down through your legs without that whole rotation happening through that spine. And that centerpiece of that whole model would be your spine. So I think it's more just naming his theory after that, because it's involving the rotation and counter rotation of that spine and those pieces, and not just, moving the legs, using the glute to kind of propel the entire body forward.
Well, I love it. I really don't disagree with anything that you guys are saying here. However, let's get into the nuances of the theory, right? Right off the get-go, Sergei Gredkevsky named it. So we're starting off there, right? The spinal engine theory. And I've been guilty of just saying spinal engine instead.
Yeah.
So I can see what you're saying, Caesar. It's like, when you hear that, it does sound like the spine is actually doing the movement. So I may have been guilty in the past of that. However, it is really a dance between the fascial recoils, the muscles firing, and the counter rotations happening at the shoulder and hip complex because of the bend of the spine. Okay. From there, there's also an area that I haven't really got into in any of the podcasts. I don't know if you listen to them, but Freyet's laws, where a spine will rotate, the actual vertebrae will rotate differently when a spine is bent versus when it's straight. Okay, so there's certain actual counter rotations that happen at the vertebrae because of the fascial pulls that happen during the counter rotations, and your spine behaves differently when it's bent. Okay, so I think there's implications to the efficiency behind the spinal motions. Okay, like you can obviously run with your spine as a passive column. We see sprinters doing it all the time. The brace the core model is everywhere outside our little niche. Okay, so you can absolutely get power without using your spine and harnessing the fascial recoils that happen naturally because of the quote unquote spinal engine. However, I would say your movements become much, much, much more efficient when you start harnessing those recoils and allowing your body to relax.
Do you want to go ahead, Caesar? Or do you want to chime in? Do you want me to say something there?
Yeah, I'll respond to that. It's cool. Maybe just keep the order. But yeah, so what's neat about this is that we are still in agreement. What I think, and going back to what I was saying before about this, it's like the linguistics of thing and reductionist thinking is, I think that in a way, whether he meant to or not, Grakovetsky establishes or presents us with like a false dichotomy, that it's either this pedestrian model of locomotion where it's the legs as the driver and spine as the passive column, or it's this spinal engine theory where it's the spine that's the driver and the legs are just along for the ride. I don't think that any of these things are along for the ride. I think it's the dance of all of them together that makes it happen. So to me, like, when we're talking about these, the addition of rotation as a consequence of this like lateral bend of the lumbar spine, there's this section where he does, he grabs this model, right? And I think you guys have seen it, like the little metal thing with the two red pieces. But when he twists it, he goes and he demonstrates how, hey, this middle bends and all that. But my question for this whole thing is really along, okay, but what is it that drives that? Is because when he grabs it, I think intuitively we kind of know, like, you don't grab the middle and move the top and bottom part. He didn't bend the middle part to move the red rods. He grabbed the shoulder girdle in that model and the hip girdle, and he rotated those. And it's those actions that then cause the lateral bend and this axial rotation in the spine. So when we dig like deeper into the model, I feel like that's what he's getting at anyway. He talks about like the power coming from the glutes and the biceps femoris and how it attaches like to the lower parts of the spine and that kind of thing through its attachments at the sacrum. So to me, it's like, if we have to start putting the power outside of the engine, that's why I go back to like, what do we really mean by engine? Because that's not really how engines work. If those things are what's causing the rotation and the side bending, if that relationship is what's making it go, then I don't really think it makes sense to suggest to other people that might not dig as deeply into the theory that it's the spine driving it. So really, I think it kind of comes down to, sure, the spine side bends, it actually rotates. There's this counter rotation in the hips and shoulders, but what is it that makes that happen? And I don't think it's the spine. I don't think it's even the structures around the spine.
So what I'm hearing so far is that everyone here is kind of in agreement that the spine does move during locomotion. Like the spinal waving action, none of us are being like, no, the spine, we're not in the brace the core model. None of us are in the brace the core model where we're training anti-rotation and doing any of that stuff. But what I'm hearing is the disagreement is structurally, what originates that spinal movement? Even the elastic recoil making of the tissues surrounding the spine, making locomotion more efficient. It sounds like we're all in agreement of that. What I'm hearing from you is, when he took that model, he did the counter rotation from the hips and shoulders. So maybe it's sounding like maybe the structures around the hips and shoulders and the limbs are creating that counter rotation, and the spine is sort of that like intersection between the two, creating more efficiency in the movement. So Devon, you kind of like what I heard from your comment, at least like if I pull up the comment from you originally, so the spine is the main driver of movement. The legs follow along like whips, and the arms assist the shoulders in counter rotating the pelvis. Was kind of, how you began your thought. Do you want to elaborate kind of on your position?
So in the spinal engine theory, it states that the limbs are really there to amplify the spine's movement. So it's not saying that the limbs passively follow along. And yeah, I do say that they whip along with that. But you got to think the spine is what's causing all that rotary movement. All that rotational movement is going to be coming from the lumbopelvic hip complex and that thoracic counter rotating, and then causing everything else below to basically maintain their shape. So if I can counter rotate one way and then counter rotate back and start creating this oscillation back and forth, I can essentially throw energy down and around each time I'm landing, which causes you to have safer structures below, right? This allows you to rotate your pelvis while you move from one leg to the next, right? I would actually argue that you develop these movements from a baby, from crawling, right? You crawl using lateral flexion of the spine to bring one leg forward. When you bring that one pelvis or that one hip forward, you're laterally flexing to one side by bringing your one hip higher than the other. This eccentrically, isometrically loads the opposite side of the leg. All right. We also know the lateral line functions with your QL to your contralateral glute medius on the opposite side, with your same side down on that glute medius, your adductors. So I really think you start to develop this lateral flexion as a crawl, as a baby, right? And then as you start to stand up on 2 feet, you start to fall forward while you do that lateral flexion. And if you stand up and you pick up one hip and you fall forward, well, you've just rotated. You've just added the third plane into that movement, which is now walking, right? So you look at animals on 4 legs, quadrupeds and all that, and they're really not rotating as much as you'd think. It's more a byproduct of that lateral flexion, right? And the pieces are following along behind that. So you see their legs doing the bows in the corners and all that stuff. But really, are they bowing and cornering those things, or is it absorbing energy, releasing energy, and then the foot's following along with that pelvis as it's moving? Because you don't rotate downward into the ground as you crawl forward. That wouldn't make too much sense. You laterally flex to go forward when you're facing the ground with your chest, right? When you stand upright, that's when that third plane comes into the play, where you start rotating to move forward. So to me, that would mean that you're actually using your pelvis, picking that thing up, falling forward, rotating your pelvis forward while your chest is counter rotating that, causing the whole spinal engine thing to happen, lateral flexion with that little bit of a bend, right? Then that takes to the other side as you whip back and forth, and it keeps that pattern going back and forth as you start to move forward. So to me, that's kind of the main driver. If you have to start utilizing those movements of all the muscles that surround the spine that get them to laterally flex and then counter rotate, it kind of seems like the spine is the center point of all those pieces. So for all those pieces to work properly, you kind of need a spine that does what it's supposed to do, right? Now, I do think a lot of that gets lost in watching slow motion film and things because of byproducts, which Caesar touched on just a tiny bit in the beginning. I don't know if that was before we started or not, but I'm very big on byproducts, of not training the byproducts you see on video, because they happen due to other forces that happen when you move, right? So why would I try to land on the outside edge of my foot type of movement if I just sent all this energy down there, whipping to the side, causing a huge lateral rotational force to hit my leg? If I'm already on the outside of my foot, where's my foot going to go? It's going to continue to roll, which is not a good thing, right? So I just argue more for, I would say that spinal engine is causing everything to happen. And then as you start adding that rotation to that whole movement, you see the whole thing start to work together. Again, the limbs amplify that movement by propelling you more, or your arm reaches and grabs and helps rotate the shoulder as it moves through space. they amplify that movement. That is the rotation happening right through your thoracolumbar junction, really. I don't know if that answers that or what. I know I went on a little bit.
all that's great. It's really hard to parse out all the ideas that are presented, right? Because there's about 30 there. So right off the get-go, I'm just gonna throw it out. The importance of making sure that we know that the spine actually does move and we shouldn't keep our core braced as a cue is very important. In terms of, it's huge because it opens doors, really. When I came from a lifting background, I would always brace my core for everything, including locomotion. And that stopped me. That didn't allow me to have balance, which leads to the next thing. It's like, what is actually happening there? To me, the spinal engine or the fascial recoils that happen when the spine moves from side to side are because you're trying to be in balance. Like, your body wants to find balance. The question is, how do you find balance? To me, the simplest cue and how I do it is have my head go over my foot. At that exact point, I'm in balance. Okay. So that really requires when you're on one leg, not when you're on two, when you're on one, to have your head over your foot at that exact moment in time. You are in balance. You have a choice of what you can do. So when you start cutting laterally and moving in 360, that becomes way more important. If you watch my like boxing videos on Instagram, I'm spinning super fast. That's the one cue I have in my head. So Devon, I saw a video you posted going down the stairs, and I'm gonna pull it up here so I can show you. And I just want you to kind of run me through it here.
So I think something you have to look at with these things is what forces are predominantly happening during a movement. So when you're running straight forward, yeah, your head's probably going to land head over foot. It's the way your vestibular system's designed to keep you balanced. But when you're moving laterally, it's going to depend on how quick the movement is and how fast back and forth is it.
Can you see my screen there, Will?
Yeah, I got it.
Sorry,
because I pulled it up. I pulled it up on the share screen there for you.
Oh, you did? Okay. Yeah. My bad. Let me get back here.
Yeah. So as I was saying with that, what I would say is it really depends on what you're looking for there. So if I'm running and I'm going to stop really fast on one leg to the side, I'm running, I make a cut really hard to the side. You really think your head should go all the way over to your foot? Or probably not.
No,
I think your head should stay within your feet or over your foot. And it's going to depend on the forces that are happening at that time when you make a movement and what movement you make. So everything is really relative to what you're doing, right? Basketball, watch a guy hit a crossover. His head's not going to be over his foot making that cross. I'm not trying to get all the way over here to only come all the way back here with my head. So I really think there's nuance to that stuff. And that's why you really have to be careful when you compare different pictures together and you compare little clips of things without having that context of what the movement actually is and what speed it's being performed at, right? So how fast is someone going? How much force is being absorbed and taken? Are you going up and down an item? Are you going straight ahead? Are you just moving left and right? That stuff really helps the context there. But go ahead. Do you have a question with that?
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying there. However, in skiing, like I ski quite a bit, when you're putting lateral force, I'm definitely not head over foot. I'm using the centripetal force coming down to match what should be the angle. Okay, so the proper angle of attack now becomes my head over foot because I have a different force going through me. So I understand the variables there, and that's why we're clearing this up, right?
100%. And I would even say it's like the force vector. Where's the force vector? What angle is force hitting you at? It's gravity plus the direction you're moving plus momentum and all that. So it's really the force vector there. Centrifugal force will play into other things, but as far as the head over foot, I don't know if it plays as big of a movement into that.
So
just to clear that up for some people.
So here's the thing though, if you were to stop yourself or slow yourself down, your head would have to go over your foot here to keep balance, right? So it says the spinal engine. To me, I can see, like, I actually do this in dance quite a bit. And I'll pull up a video maybe in a bit that's showing a dancer actually do this move over and over and over again, and how the counter rotations in the spine are pulling the fascia. You're almost doing a reverse quote unquote spinal engine here, right? Because you're—
Is that what you would think? I would disagree. I would say this is the spinal engine moving. Why would you say it's reverse? Let me hear it. Why would you say it's reverse?
Because usually when you're walking, your head must travel from side to side, not
You're
your
walking,
spine
right?
twisting. What's that?
Are you, but that's when you're walking. I'm not walking here, right? This is where you have to look at forces again. This is like you doing a, it would be like more of a Taekwondo type kick. So if you're doing like a kick and you're jumping from one leg to the other doing a kick, you're not necessarily getting your head over the foot on every single step you're taking because you're not moving forward in a gait pattern. This is going down the stairs, right? This is moving forward and down the stairs. It's absorbing more force at a time when I have to recoil back to the other side. And if I want to land properly with my leg in a proper shape, I need to send that rotational force all the way down my leg in time so that my one hip can be higher or in front of my other hip. And that's what causes us to keep those stabilizations down the leg. It keeps my glute medius active, my adductor active, my contralateral QL. So I would say you can't compare this. If I was walking straight and I looked like this, yeah, I would say that's goofy. But I'm not. I'm jogging down the steps in a certain pattern to try to get certain things rotating while I'm stabilizing others. Do you see what I'm saying? You're comparing like apples to oranges here with a walk versus a jog down the steps.
Okay, let me counter that by saying that if you were to make a move laterally or anything like that, I actually have a video dancing on the stairs, and I have to go head over foot because it's a balance context thing, right? If you were to slow down and try to cut laterally, your head would have to move over the landing foot or close to. You're going to move towards that direction. And at the exact point when you're over your foot, that's why, like I'm saying, that when you're walking and your foot lands and your head's over that foot, that's when your body's most relaxed, and you can use that not rotational force, but the lateral force from your actual fascia to propel you to the other side. So what I'm saying is, in this, it looks like you would be using more muscular force. However, I see that the context of moving and rotating your hips.
Here's my take to that would be this. I think your view of the spinal engine and my view are different. I don't think your body passively bends to the side and does these things like you're saying, how it would kind of do this and that. I think those are byproducts that you see from force, from vertical ground reaction forces, essentially, right? Because we know one of the biggest problems people have in their gait is actually a lateral hip shift. And that is when they fall into one hip and they overdo that hip joint. They basically fall through the musculature into their hip joint, and it causes a knee valgus, and it causes you to see what would look like a spinal engine type movement, right? This is what you guys would say would be more spinal engine, would be kind of that kind of deal, right?
No.
Could you go ahead and describe it for me?
It's literally just this. If I was to walk, my head would just go like this.
So you're not moving your spine at all. Your just whole body's kind of going back and forth.
It's slightly done. It's just like my head relaxes. My body's relaxed. I can do this in boxing, like over. I know I'm balanced here.
I agree, but when you're moving that fast, you're taking on other forces than when you're walking, right? So you're not getting what I'm saying there. So I'm saying when you walk, it's much different than when you jog, and when you jog, it's different than when you sprint. You don't land in the same place. You don't land at the exact same feeling, and you would technically be rotating slightly different. Like when I walk, I wouldn't have as much of an oscillation as when I jog and as when I run. So you're comparing something different. When you walk, your head should land over your foot, in my opinion. When you're jogging down the stairs, I don't think your head should go back and forth over your foot, because it's wherever your body's going to counter that force the best.
Like we were talking about. Though?
Say again?
At every step there, are you in balance?
Yeah, I would say I'm pretty balanced with the forces going on. That's like when you sprint. When you full out sprint and you just stop, are you in balance?
No. What do you mean?
You're just asking me the same question. I'm jogging down the steps. How would I have to? Are you saying I have to stop and balance each time?
Oh, so you're passing the energy from side to side, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah. I'm not trying to go down and stop on one. I guess I don't understand
the core model here, where your head is in the middle and your legs are on the side. It presents the same problem in my I'm just laying out my theory, right?
Yeah. No, I'm just trying to grasp what you're saying.
Exact second, then you're not in balance.
Can I?
So go ahead, Anthony.
I think what I'm hearing is Will's model is kind of this idea that you can have your center of gravity. What I'm hearing is you're saying that there's other forces happening that are pushing you from side to side that would make it so that when your head is landing over your foot, that doesn't necessarily mean your center of gravity is actually centered and balanced when you're going down the stairs. Your center of gravity is different when you're in forward locomotion on flat or even slightly inclined or declined ground versus when you're specifically trying to drop your whole center of gravity down a set of stairs. The head over foot is less relevant because just, getting your head over your foot in this column is less relevant because you're dropping your foot lower and you're trying to counteract different forces that are happening from your pelvis dropping to the lower step. Is that kind of right?
Yeah. No, I'd agree with that. Yeah.
And so Will's basically saying his center of gravity is always balanced when he lands his head over his foot because his whole center is stacked over this column, right? Like to use that language. So so I think the confusion and the disconnect between what Will is saying and what you're saying is like, how would you explain how the actual force vectors are different going down a set of stairs that would negate needing to have your head or your center of gravity in this column? Like what's actually happening from a physics perspective that would change that?
So the amount of rotational force I'm producing through my upper body and countering with my upper body and producing through my LPH, when I'm going down the stairs, I've got all this rotational energy, which produces a lateral force down at my lower limbs, right? So rotational creates this lateral force to hit down at my limbs when I land on the ground. And when I'm doing that, I'm dropping down another 6 inches to a foot, which adds more vertical ground reaction force, which means my body actually has to resist more of that side movement or else I won't have balance. Because if I'm going to run and start going like this down the stairs, I'm not going to have a very good vision. I'm not going to be able to keep my body going and landing where I need it to. So I really think it's going to be dependent on what activity you're doing, because I agree. When I box, when I move, I'm going to do the same things. I'm going to bend like this. But that's not the same thing as your gait pattern. And it's not the same thing as you going down the stairs the way I'm going. Right. So I think it's just a different argument there. I think we should talk on what the spinal engine truly means with that, though, because I think that there might be a little bit of like, he views it this way, I view it this way, which is a really good thing we can kind of move into with this. Do you have something, Cesar? Sorry.
Yeah, I got excited throughout all of that because I guess I finally have something to disagree with. I mean, it's exciting when we agree.
Go for it.
It's exciting when we agree, and it's exciting the other way too. So yeah, I think again, the attributes versus byproducts thing. We're seeing some of these same behaviors: the head moving the way, the fascia coiling, all this stuff. But what's making it happen? And this is why at the beginning I talked a little bit about Krakovetsky's evolutionary arguments, because he talks about how like first it was the spine, and then the legs were added later as an improvement, not a replacement. But this stuff goes way before we even have spines. And if we go down to even like molecular motors and gametes like sperm, like the way these things move, I would argue is the way most creatures move, and we talk about fish in a minute, but like where the head goes, the body follows. The spine sets up the necessary preconditions for the forward locomotive drive to happen. So I would agree with William, what he was saying earlier, like the head starts to go one way. So we do laterally, bend and rotate, and that kind of, to me, cocks us to go forward. But there's no forward movement until the legs and the hips engage and push us forward. I can do this in place all day, or even if I elevated myself and tried to do that same pattern, which is not what we see in that video with the legless person. I'll talk about that in a minute too. But like if I pick up my legs and I rotate back and drop into this back pocket and keep doing that, I'm not going to move. I'm basically doing Russian twists. And I can add more force to that, but like I'm not going forward. But if I did want to go forward, I would do something like that. My head would go over, let's say, my landing column, and I'd rotate into that, and then I would drive. That's why I think when you guys are talking about this, action of cutting, that's why the head doesn't go over the foot, because when we're looking to make a dynamic change of direction, if your head kept going that way, you would keep going that way. So the head has to be outside of column for something like that when we're trying to stop. But again, going back to these animals, if we think about something like, so I mentioned sperm, but also fish, because Grakovetsky talks about those a good bit. You know, you look at something like a hagfish, they are going to lead with their head, but that only bends their body enough so that the back part can drive them forward. And this is only exaggerated like the further and further you go. So when you get to like tuna forms, like tuna, for example, like they've got fins, but most of their musculature sits in the ass, and their backside is what's driving them forward. It's just the head that steers. And so to me, you know, there is this sort of mention of like that drill going down the stairs. It looks a little bit different than normal locomotion. And I think Devon was suggesting that like it is different. It's apples and oranges. To me, what that reminds me of is sort of like David Weck has come up with a number of ways to like move maybe more efficiently than the normal gait pattern. Like when he's doing his same side stride kind of stuff to come around corners, like there is something to that, but it is apples and oranges compared to like normal locomotive gait. You know, William, when you were describing the drill of going downstairs, you said something about moving in reverse, and that's something that Devon and I talked about maybe a little bit last week. In Goda, there's like a lot of talk about like reverse movement, which to me essentially just means like we can see similar things happening, you know, but the rate at which joints are cycling and the order in which they're cycling makes a big difference. And if we can hop off of Grakovetsky for a minute and go, I want to talk about something that Stuart McGill said in relation to this spinal engine theory, you know, and if anybody's listening, like Stu McGill's sort of like the leading spinal biomechanist of our time, maybe.
We've talked.
I'm gonna have to read this
on a few episodes.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, we've brought him up on a few episodes. We've like pulled up clips from him and stuff and broken down what he's broken down.
So he says, you know, going back to that model with like the twisting shoulders that Grakovetsky uses, and he says, well, the problem is that it's true for a rod made of fiberglass or graphite or something like that. So let's replicate the motions that he's showing in his graphite rod in a real person. What you have to do is walk while swinging your hips, rolling each hip over. Well, when you measure people, there are some people who have totally the opposite pattern in their hips. In other words, their spinal engine is in reverse. So to me, like even Stu McGill sort of believes in reverse movement. And if I can, that's where I want to go into.
Does Stuart McGill believe in the spinal engine? Or is he? No. He's a brace the core guy, right? Just to put that out there.
Yeah. I mean, I would say my understanding of Stu McGill is that he's a brace the core guy when necessary. Like he's braced the core if you're, you know, resisting an axial load on the spine. But I don't necessarily think that he's like a Palov press for football kind of guy.
I think it's a good topic to go on in general. Is like is brace your core? Is it brace your core versus spinal engine theory? Is it brace your core when you train but not when you run? Is it spinal core only? You know what I mean? This is a big thing with a lot of methods that don't seem to define these things. I have a hard time feeling like you could train your core really, really hard to stay still. And then when it needs to fire with the most neuromuscular like action possible, it's going to then somehow move. Mm-hmm. So I differ from feeling like you can mix those in together and seeing those things. But I do think some models can have golden nuggets that you could take away and add to maybe the spinal engine theory or something like that, just to give a little peace of mind on the end of that.
Yeah, I think brace the core, you know, like maybe sometimes in warm-ups, like it's good for activating the neuromuscular system. But once you get going, like you've got to be moving and you can't brace the core. I think it's something natural that happens in us when it's necessary. Essentially, it happens in anticipation of a task that we're ill-equipped for. If you don't have the skill, so in martial arts, maybe like the martial skill, but even if we think about strength being a skill, if your nervous system registers that some task is coming up that it is not prepared for, then we will automatically, reflexively inhale and brace the core. It doesn't need to be taught to us. It's built into the operating system as like a sort of backup when we're ill-equipped. So to me, I would look at it like when it comes to performance, maybe every once in a while you want to hit some kind of maximal load, just see what you can do or something like that. But in general, we're trying to improve our capacity, not improve our ability to fall back on the sort of like default, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Can I touch on something there?
Yeah,
so in the beginning of that, I think Caesar talked about how you can't really move without, pushing yourself forward. And I disagree with that. You actually learn to move as a baby by falling. You learn to fall forward. That's kind of how you learn to move forward, is you constantly stand up and fall. And if you pick up one leg and you fall forward, you do rotate. And when the time comes where you actually learn to land on that leg, you're then balancing on that leg to then rotate and fall to the next leg, right? This also coincides with the whole idea that we move predominantly in our gait pattern with isometric and eccentric actions that an elastic recoil assists our concentric movements in. We don't necessarily move around by squeezing our butt. We don't hump forward to drive and run forward, right? So that begs the idea that we really have to train the body more in this eccentric isometric movement to allow the elastic byproducts to happen and recoil and assist those concentric actions. Meaning you can't you can't drive movement fully based off concentrics. It has to be more of a byproduct of, let's say I take that step, vertical ground forces hit, they go into my lumbodorsal fascia, that loads up, that recoils. My glute has loaded up and recoiled. All these things have loaded and unloaded. They're not fully contracting all the way through to make you move forward. Now, it might look like that on camera, but at that point, I can guarantee you that guy who's running is not squeezing his butt cheek when his leg's way behind him. That's happening as a byproduct, right? It already became stretched and then recoiled all the way back to that point. So I really do think like movement is driven more by that rotation. And as you build that rotation, you then teach your lower body how to handle that rotation properly. And then as you teach your lower body, so I'll just keep talking here. So based on with my theory and things, you can't rotate properly unless you are stabilized. So an inefficient rotation is a lateral hip shift and then a rotation, right? That means you fall into your joint and then you rotate. That's not true rotation. That's a shift and a rotation. So you need to stabilize the lumbopelvic hip complex. That way it can rotate properly, which is what I think happens when you crawl, right? You're always on your knees, pushing the ground slightly apart as you're in this quadruped type position. So you're essentially creating lateral stability through your lumbopelvic hip complex. Then your arms are in front of you, also creating a lateral type stability through your shoulder girdle, right? Now, once you have that lateral stability, then you can start to think about rotational movements or lateral bending that will cause a rotational movement because you've stabilized those two things, right? That still allows the spine to do any movement it needs, side bending, any freedom it has, because you're just stabilizing the shoulder and the pelvis, right? The lumbopelvic hip. That allows you to get that rotation through your thoracic. Well, we know we need thoracic rotation. It allows you to do those things, right? But then as you're teaching your spine to do that, you have to get what I consider neutralized femur alignment, right? So neutralized femur alignment means your kneecap should face forward when your pelvis faces forward, right? Internal alignment would mean your kneecaps face inward when your pelvis is forward. External alignment would mean your kneecaps face outward when your pelvis is forward. So my goal would be to get a human or a person back to neutral alignment while creating lateral stability in that lumbopelvic hip complex, which allows them to then rotate properly through that lower half. Then you have to connect the upper half with that, because we know a lot of people are very disconnected, and you have to teach them how to counter rotate without, let's say, losing all intra-abdominal pressure. I don't know if you guys talk a lot about that stuff, but I think intra-abdominal pressure plays a large part. And I think it's one of the pieces that the spinal engine gets wrong, because I think he's against IAP in the spinal engine. I think he actually argues against it a little bit. Does he argue for it or against it, William? Do you know? I know in the book, I thought he touched on it.
He does mention it. Like he does mention that if you are, like, let's say you have a fat belly, it's going to pull the thoracolumbar fascia harder, and that intra-abdominal pressure can help you stabilize, like,
okay. So in the book, I actually read that he argues against intra-abdominal pressure slightly, because at a certain amount of pressure, your blood pressure rises too much and it would cause too much injury to the body, meaning you can't possibly lift a certain amount of weight while maintaining that intra-abdominal pressure. But I think he goes wrong with that, because when you're running, you're not necessarily taking all of that weight on one spot of your spine. Your spine does more of a whipping motion, which, as I kind of mentioned in our comments, it helps dissipate force, kind of like a fishing rod. It allows that force to go through, and it doesn't just center all that force in one spot. So intra-abdominal pressure could still play a large role in that upper body with movement. From that, I think a lot of people are very disconnected with that intra-abdominal pressure, so they don't rotate very well or counter-rotate up top very well. All right. What you start to see is then somebody who rotates with half of their body, but not the upper half, or vice versa. And it causes a lot of issues. So I guess as a whole, I'm very much for, I think the muscles around the spine actually move the lumbopelvic hip system or complex and the shoulder complex, causing all those other things to happen down below. Now, do you have to really focus on those things below to get things set up for the things up top to happen? 100%. But the reason that happens to me is because lifestyle and training. Again, you've taught yourself to be a concentric dominant mover, right? I don't say reverse movement. I don't think that's a thing. I think you've adapted your body to have too much external rotation, too much concentric action in your external rotators, which causes you to get piriformis syndrome, causes you to get sciatica, causes a lot of stuff back there to bunch up and actually constrict the neural pathways down behind the glutes, which a lot of people have issues with, right? So I think you have to get them back their internal rotation so they're back to neutral, stabilize those hips, and then allow the spinal engine to do what it's got to do. And again, I train it. I don't think it's passive. I don't think it just wobbles. I train like essentially lateral flexion into the spine the proper way, I believe. And then, the other stuff I've already repeated a few times. So let's keep going. Yeah, go ahead, Caesar. Sorry. Talk a bunch.
So
boys.
To me, this is neat, because this is where, Devon, I feel like, going back to what I said at the beginning, like this is an area when you're talking about this, the stabilization of the pelvis, where I feel like you're my teacher on this. And what I picked up from you has led me like in the opposite way. And so let me explain that. Because you're talking about, the importance of stabilizing this lumbopelvic hip complex, or LPHC. And so the hand motions are like this, right? So we need this stability to drive that to me is like where this drive is coming from, as opposed to something like this. And so I'm going to adjust my camera real quick, guys. But
what's that great that these guys always talk about?
Well, so that part, that's where maybe we disagree. That to me
that's
is like, so there's like earlier you said like where I said like we can't move without this. I totally believe, the human body's incredible. You could lock up our spine, bind our hands, bind our feet. We'll find a way to move forward, probably leading with that. But just because we can move away doesn't necessarily mean that it would like fall within what we might consider like optimal human gait or locomotive patterns. So there's this basically like a Brazilian jiu-jitsu exercise that I fucking hate. But it's basically teaching people to walk like the guy in the video. Now, Grakovetsky, he asked this question, I think before he gets to that video, he says, like how much of the leg can we eliminate? And ultimately he says all of it. And that's where I think he makes a huge mistake. Because what the person doing in the video is moving forward, but I don't think he's walking, or at least not in a way that we would consider optimized. So he's lifting up, like one ilium to throw the ipsilateral ischium forward and do the same thing over and over again. Now, there's another example Grakovetsky gives where he talks about like we can walk on our knees, and where I think he misses the opportunity for I guess to really be onto something is when you go to the knees. So you eliminate the lower leg, but you still have some leg. You can actually do both patterns. So you don't need to see my head for this, but essentially what the person with no legs is doing. Uh-oh, did I lose you? Okay.
Sorry,
So
I can pull up a video of it if you want.
I actually have one. I have one pulled up right now.
Keep going, Caesar. Keep going. I think he's on a separate idea than the actual walking video. So I want to keep going with that.
Okay.
So in the video, the guy's lifting his hip, throwing his hip forward, dropping, lifting and throwing his hip forward, as opposed to like when we walk, and even if we were crawling, right, the head moves over, like we cock back to set the stage to drive ourselves forward. So if I wanted to walk on my knees in something that would approximate normal upright locomotion, it would be here and here, as opposed to here and here. And that to me is what I, whether we agree on the term or not, that's what I would see as reverse movement. And if we're familiar, I think you guys have talked about WEC stuff. I listened to some of your podcasts before. When you watch that video of the person walking on his hips, it messes up the gait so bad that the counter rotation in the shoulders is also improperly cycling. So he's cycling overhand eights with his shoulders just to make it happen. And because he doesn't have this lower body stabilization of the pelvis, that to me would explain why this guy basically has no lumbar curvature. Because without the legs there for the muscles to anchor off of, he can't stabilize the pelvis he needs to. He has to throw his pelvis around. We
All
don't
right,
walk.
let me give my take here. So
Sure.
I 100% think this is how the spinal engine works and how you walk. So this is where we differ, right?
Yeah.
I find the problem with this model to be that he can't stabilize the hips in a neutral hip alignment because apparently he's got no femurs there, right? He's just pure on the ischial tuberosity, I think. Right. So more or less, I would say that you do whip your body around this way. I think he lacks that lumbar spine because he's had to tuck his pelvis to kind of get some cushion onto his glutes as he's curling that spine around. Right. So I would say this is actually how you whip it around. And even the arms, when you run, what happens is you throw this arm forward and then it catches here to stretch the lumbar or stretch the lat. When the lat stretches and then recoils, it actually anteriorly tilts and pulls the pelvis forward on that side. So when you run, you do actually take this force right here that causes that hip to follow along. All right. So I would argue that this is the spinal engine, very true to how it would work. And if you added someone's legs on there, you would start to see this whipping type motion. Now, does he have to do extra because he's got no limbs? Yeah. That's why the limbs amplify the spinal engine. They make it perform even better. But without limbs, he's got to do extra work to try to throw his shoulders forward while he throws the opposite side pelvis. The problem becomes when you add a leg to this model, people start now thinking shoulder to leg. You don't walk shoulder to leg. You walk shoulder to pelvis, shoulder to hip, meaning the middle of your body is where the rotation happens, and then it whips down and follows. So if I go whip and my leg follows that motion, now I'm landing into that spot. But it's not so much just move my foot forward and land here. That would actually cause my hip to go backwards. And it would make me now very stiff in my spine, which is what a lot of people are doing, which I would then argue is not spinal engine. You're now just moving. That's like hip engine is what that would be.
Well, I agree with Devon on this one. I think like with what you said, Caesar, before, he's finding a way to do things. He's finding a way to move forward. To me, that's locomotion. It doesn't matter if he's on his ischial tuberosities. He's locomoting forward. And if you look, he has to counter rotate so much out of the shoulder complex. It ends up looking a lot more like a rotating a lot plus swiveling his hips in an overhand fashion way too much. But that is because he doesn't have limbs. It is because he can't drive out of his glutes. You're right about that. It is always a dance. So you will find a compensatory strategy here, but I still think it's showing how the spinal engine is working without limbs. So, which is Greg Kevsky's point, right? The counterpoint before Greg Kevsky and still the wisdom is that the spine is a passive column. This is demonstrating that it's not a passive column in the least anyway, right? And I do agree with what you're saying, Devon, almost everything you said here, but this kind of reminds me of what you did on the stairs, where you're absorbing the forces and your head's remaining in the middle and you're using those rotations to absorb the force. So I just wanted to say that I understand that you can do that. However, if I was to trip up your foot in one of those steps, you would definitely go for a fall. Okay. But if my head's over my foot, and I'm not going to fall. And I understand that there's
one of my feet isn't on the ground. So you'd have to kick out the leg that's on the ground, which of course that's going to trip me up.
Yeah, but it's accelerating. It's accelerating towards one direction, right? And you're using the rotation to catch you and absorb that force. However, that's like do you actually normally walk down the stairs like that, or
So let me
walk
say
like
this.
that?
Let me say this. So, because it's more of a rotational movement that I'm doing down the stairs. When someone swings a baseball bat, does their head go over their foot?
Sometimes.
Let's say very rarely. All right.
Okay.
You're not trying to shift your head way over your foot while you're swinging a bat. It's not efficient for tracking. All right. So this is another part of this byproduct that I would say. I think your head going over your foot is more of a byproduct of one, balance, right? And then two, it's going to depend on what you're doing in tracking wise. So if I'm sprinting straight ahead of me, I can keep my head on track while my shoulders move, countering my hips, and my head will decouple that motion. What that means is my head will move in this fashion. It'll actually move more with my chin here, right? Because this gives our cervical spine, which is also lordotic, the same slight flexion and slight rotation. What that does is allows for the center dot right here for our vision to stay more straight. So when we move, we actually are allowed to move our head, but our goal is to keep our vision online. So I would say a lack of movement through the head or too much movement through the head can actually show a lot of dysfunction. And maybe right there you see a little bit of maybe years of my powerlifting showing up, or that's just how it should be when you run down the steps in that manner, or maybe I need to get my feet closer. So I think it's tough to really argue when it's a guy running down the steps doing that. I think if you ran down the steps doing it and filmed it, I think we'd be able to compare them better. And then you'd kind of see which one looks more fluid or natural and what's actually happening with it. But yeah, overall, I think I get you. I understand what you're saying. I'm not trying to argue it too much.
So guys, we're coming up on the hour mark, and I just wanted to invite, I know you guys have a bit of a time constraint and you have to cut off soon. So if anyone wanted to ask any questions in the chat, now would be the time to do it. But Caesar, you had a point.
We're definitely going to call together too.
Yeah. So what I want to say, because William, you mentioned like that, again, the guy in the video, that is locomotion. And I would say, sure. And that's why at the very beginning of this, I said, it kind of depends on what we mean when we say driver. I would say that if it was possible for a person to still be alive, if you cut them off at the pectoral line, they would still be able to locomote forward because they would crawl, they would drag their chin. But that would not be a fair argument for like, I don't know, a shoulder girdle engine theory. What he is doing is moving forward, but that's not human locomotion, or that's not a normal gait. And to me, I would present that the reason he's not doing that is because he can't, because the legs are much more of a driver than this model gives them credit for. Of course, the spine is important and it is interacting, but again, he's having to lift his hip up and throw it forward because he doesn't have legs. When we have legs, we drive off of them. We tuck the hip back before we drive, not lift it up. When we look at something like let's say a bench press versus a push-up, right? Open versus closed chain movements, like the neuromuscular activation patterns for those things are completely flipped based on what's like open and closed. And I mentioned that in my post a little bit. And that's what I think is happening here. He has to turn this into an open chain movement. It is the reverse of what's supposed to happen. So just because he's moving, to me, does not prove this thing at all. I think that there's a number of just even basic thought experiments, like, well, like a thought experiment might be, you take a little kid and put him in a roll of carpet and then put roller skates on him. And, put him in a roll of carpet with no skates and just leave his feet bare. Like that person's going to still be able to move forward with something approximating a normal gait. Mm-hmm. But if you lock their spine down, I'm getting mixed up here. If you put the roller skates back on, but their spine were free, and you just let them move around, they're not going anywhere. If you tie their ankles together, they're not going anywhere because they don't have the drive. The wiggle sets up for the driver to work, but the wiggle can't be the driver. And this is why, if we compare this video to people that have something like total spinal fusions or ankylosing spondylitis, when their spine is fused and can't do that side bend and lateral rotation, their gait pattern still looks way more normal than what you're seeing in this video. And if you look at this video and you think like it's just because he has to overcompensate, he has to throw himself even more, I would suggest to you, and I've done this, like I slowed that video down to 0.008 speed and tried to like frame by frame copy that myself, it feels weird as hell. We can look at the kinematics of it and see that the spine is bending and rotating the same way that it would in a gait. But because of the way that you have to activate to do it, the forces are going to be different, and it is not the same.
Super cool. Now, before I kind of want to wrap that up. I think that's a really, really cool point. I know we could go on forever, but I know we also don't have forever.
Literally,
Maybe we could do a follow-up episode, because this has been some of the best conversation that we've had on here. And I love not just the amount of agreement, but disagreement that we've had in this episode so far. How are you guys doing for time? Do you have time to answer like one or two questions?
I'm good.
Or do you guys have to jet?
I can do one or two.
Okay. So, if I'm just taking a look here, there was one question. How do the shoulders interact with the lumbopelvic hip complex in locomotion? How do the shoulders actually work in running, et cetera? Because we obviously talked about the counter rotation of the spine with the hips and the shoulders. And I know, Devon, you kind of alluded to some of the action going through the shoulders, how it, stretches out the lat to kind of use that. So, how do you guys think that the shoulders interact with that lumbopelvic hip complex?
I'll go first if you don't mind, Caesar. What I would say is your arms and your shoulders, basically, like it says, it amplifies the movement. It amplifies how you would counter rotate your LPH. So the way it interacts, the way your shoulders would interact with that LPH is that they learn how to counter it. They learn how to go the opposite way. And then they use your arms to amplify that effect to counter your hips. So if you see my hips, they're turning this way, shoulders turning that way. So I would say as you go, when you run, your shoulders do two things. I'm very much a byproducts guy. So I think of a door spring, and I think a door spring is here and it can be pulled and it can kind of go back and forth until it finds neutral again, like homeostasis. And I think the arm is very similar to that. It has a very good stable spot here. And as you move, it goes behind you and it goes in front of you. And as you do that, the muscles on the opposite side actually work as an elastic recoil, where they stop, slow down, and they accelerate. So once I hit here as I'm running, all these muscles in the front are firing very hard to decelerate my arm, which then helps fire it back forward, which snaps my chest forward and throws my body forward. And then at the same time goes forward and snaps this way, which then counter rotates my shoulders to my hips. So I would say the shoulders in themselves counter rotate the LPH. The hands and the arms and everything amplify how they counter rotate and help that out.
Just a question on top of that. Do you think it's the shoulder girdle itself or the glenohumeral joint? Basically, where do you think the humerus is in that? Is it coming forward like this, or is it remaining a little bit back in the socket?
So it's going to depend on the person. I am always about the shoulder remaining in the socket. And when you see my shoulder go forward, it's actually a chest rotation.
Yeah.
So the shoulder is staying in that position as the shoulder rotates or the thoracic rotates. And it almost gives this ringing out of the spine type feeling, right? And I don't think I wouldn't say you run and project your shoulder in that manner. But when you run and your arm has to stop and pull, and it has to connect with all those muscles, that's just what's going to happen. It's going to pull forward. Your chest and your lat are both going to kind of help that movement go as you swim across. I think you actually develop that while crawling, right? I think when you crawl, you reach your arm, you pull, and as you get to a certain point, you start to push, and you go through, and your shoulders actually start to learn how to develop that movement.
I agree.
Yeah, I would essentially agree with all that, in a way. Maybe that's the value. I wouldn't say that we need to go into like core bracing, but it's, even though it's a whip, we do need sufficient stiffness to stop us from spinning off to space, because I believe the legs and the hips would drive us, to spin. So the shoulders must counter rotate to capture some of that energy and then send it back down and across so we can take our next step.
Yeah, I'll skip the answers on this one just for time purposes.
Yeah, sweet. We had just let's do one more question here. And it's funny because I've seen this asked in other areas too. Someone's asking, Devon, why do you set wider columns? And I think this is probably, in the GOTA mindset, the columns are always really narrow. It's like you're stacking the knees under the hips and you line those columns up. Why do you set wider columns in some of your exercises?
So I set wider columns depending on the person, depending on where they're at in the program, right? I think the ultimate goal would be to get your feet underneath your hips, right? That's the ultimate goal for most people in their posture and their movement, would be able to get their everything right down in alignment with all their joints. But I don't think that's a possibility for people right out in the beginning, right? So let's say you've done 1 million hip thrusters, you've turned your knees out until your butt has completely disappeared and your lumbar spine is kind of rounding. You're not going to be able to just turn your feet in a little bit, get your knees, bend down and go into that. You're going to get what's called hip impingement, right? You lack internal rotation, you lack space in the back of your hip, and it causes the front of your hip to get pinched off. So what helps internal rotation in the beginning is abduction, right? Abduction of the hip actually accommodates more internal rotation. So it allows a person to internally rotate their femur and their hip just enough to get back to neutral, where they can start creating lateral stability and stabilize their lumbopelvic hip complex. As they get better at that, they will slowly be able to bring their feet closer and closer. I wouldn't put them my hands width apart. I like hips width. I think that's the best way to go in the end. For me personally and most clients, but you know, it will depend a little bit on the person and their build. But really, yeah, it's more of a, let's say, a regression. Like it's a regression to build yourself up as you gain more internal rotation, as the external rotators in your hip gain more capacity to open up and still activate and handle energy. You actually gain more capacity to get more internal rotation, and you honestly fix a lot of hip impingement that way.
Cool. Anything to add, anyone?
I know I streamlined
that's
the answer
something I
quick.
picked up from Devon, and I had a lot of success with it for myself and
cool.
clients too. So yeah, for those
Yeah.
listening in.
Honestly, I think we're gonna get a session in. We're gonna have a Zoom chat, a good one after this at some time too. Because I haven't talked to Caesar in a while, and it's always a good chat, man.
Yeah, well, guys, I'd like to, personally thank you for jumping on here. This has been some of my favorite conversation that we've had in terms of, one of the comments in the chat here is, you got to love this biomechanic geek conversation. And, to be honest, it's been perfectly fulfilling for me for that. This has been awesome. Thanks for coming on. I'd love to do a follow-up because obviously we, in an hour, we tried to cover 6 hours or more worth of conversation.
Yeah, right?
A
lot of
3-hour deep dive.
Yeah. So for those who are listening on Spotify and iTunes, you can also check out the video replay on nofilter.net. My name is Anthony Manuel, and you can find my host profile. We also have some great live guests coming up in the next couple of weeks, so you can always see our upcoming live events posted up there. Thank you guys so much for listening. For all the guys who joined live, this has actually been our biggest live audience yet on the Art of Move podcast. So thank you for everyone who's in here with us. And yeah, guys, thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Awesome.
Move it to your medicine.
See ya.